Hello, everybody. I hope you can hear me clearly as well as I could hear Joy. I am going to try to make the best of the next 45 minutes or so, presenting both the reviewer and the applicant perspective in terms of NIH grant writing. So specifically, I would like to explain to you just both at a granular level, somewhat of a granular level, and the 10,000-foot view of what the NIH grant review process looks like, provide general as well as NINDS program-specific tips on how you could improve your chances of success, provide my perspective on what I think makes for a good reviewer, and point you in the direction of some useful NIH resources that I hope will be helpful to you as you prepare and submit your own grant applications. So the mission of peer review is that to ensure that NIH grant applications receive a fair, independent, expert and timely review, free from inappropriate influences, so that NIH can fund the most promising science. What review does not do is make funding decisions. Its only purview is to identify the most meritorious technical and scientific applications, and it is entirely up to program to make funding decisions in which a number of other variables can come into play in addition to the priority, just the priority score or the overall impact score. The pictures below show you the first NIH study section that was in 1946 and a typical NIH study section today. As you can see, many things have changed, most for the better. And the most prominent one being that this was pretty much an old boys club, and this is much more diverse, at least in terms of gender as well as race and ethnicity. So NIH really is stressing that we get diverse viewpoints on applications that come to us for review. Now, applications can be reviewed in a standing study section, which basically are comprised of about 16 to 24 members, each serving about 4 to 6 year terms. And expertise for each study section may be supplemented with ad hoc reviewers per round as required. Or applications might be reviewed in what is called a special emphasis panel that are comprised entirely of temporary reviewers that are put together as required based on the applications or the science in the applications received. SEPs are specifically used to review applications responding to requests for applications for certain member conflicts or special programs or initiatives issued by institutes. Although in-person study sections are still the norm, NIH is using a lot of alternative review formats these days, such as teleconferences, video conferences, or virtual meetings. And your application may well be reviewed in one of those formats. So here's a typical NIH grant cycle, which is about 9 months. So you have a brilliant idea, you develop a research proposal, you submit your application. Your application first lands on the desk of the Division of Receipt and Referral at the Center for Scientific Review, which receives all NIH applications received submitted to the NIH. CSR, specifically DRR, assigns your application to an initial review group and to an NIH institute for funding. These assignments are made following set referral guidelines. Once assigned, your application undergoes peer review. The outcome of peer review is revealed to you or released to you by way of a numerical score and a summary statement. These documents then go on for further inspection by the Institute program staff, who, based on the summary statement and the score, might make recommendations to the Institute leadership and council for considering certain applications for funding. The Advisory Council then provides the second level of review for these applications. Council, as I mentioned, is advisory to the institute director and may make certain recommendations for funding. and it's the institute director who ultimately makes the funding decisions. The idea is that if you did well over here, you generally do well over here, and you end up your application ends up being awarded. So just as the Center for Scientific Review does reviews, individual institutes at NIH also have a scientific review branch. In terms of volume, although CSR reviews about 50% of all the applications NIH receives, in terms of dollars, at least for NINDS, the Institute Review Branch reviews almost as much as CSR does. In terms of what CSR reviews versus NINDS SRB reviews, these mechanisms on the slide give you some flavor of the kinds of reviews that each of the locus of review does. The Center for Scientific Review typically reviews most of the investigator-initiated applications that are submitted in response to what are called as Parent Funding Opportunity Announcement, or FOAs. NINDS tends to review in-house most complex mechanisms, any institute-specific initiatives, or any trans-NIH institutes initiatives on which NINDS is one of the lead institutes. So we review program projects in centers, multi-center clinical trials, research program awards, all of our translational programs, as well as now applications to do with the HEAL initiative or ADRD. We also review NINDS reviews fewer contracts, but we also do review our contracts in-house. So how do you as an applicant know where your application is likely to be reviewed? If you look carefully at the agency contacts listed in the funding opportunity announcement, if your application is going to be reviewed in an institute review branch, the institute review chief is usually listed as the contact on that FOA. So that's a clue for you in terms of where it's likely to be reviewed. There are differences between a CSR and an IC review, and for that matter, even amongst the different ICs. There are 27 different ICs, and each one of them differ in terms of how they review, what they review in-house, and even in terms of what they fund. So some of the differences are highlighted on this slide, and for example, the differences include the extent of use of streamlining, which is the number of applications that might get discussed in any particular study section, the use of scores alone versus percentiles. NINDS rarely uses percentiles in any of the applications reviewed in-house. Whether the applications are reviewed in standing committees or special emphasis panels, NINDS uses both. Whether the application's discussion is clustered or follows a set discussion order, CSR does. NINDS doesn't as much cluster by career stage. We do for our training study sections, though, try to cluster by mechanism so that we are comparing in some ways apples to apples and oranges to oranges. The scientific breadth of the review committees differ. They are generally broader in the institutes versus CSR just because of the sheer breadth of science that institute study sections and panels see. The level of interaction between review and program staff is very different when the review is at CSR versus an IC. At the IC, because we work closely together, review is often involved right at the stage where the program initiative is being developed, and we do provide feedback, at least on the review criteria, if not on the rest of the FOA. And another point of difference is the time frame of summary statement release. And I must say CSR is a lot quicker in timelines compared to institutes in this regard. But the point is, regardless of the locus of review, the most important tenets of peer review, which is expertise and fairness, are the same. And this part is just to remind you that because clustering by career stage and basically career stage in itself is important in many of the reviews, that you as applicants make sure you make a habit of checking your profile in the NIH ERA Commons and make sure that the NIH has the correct information regarding your career stage. Time permitting, I'll show you where you will be able to check these details and correct them if they don't reflect your dates accurately. So what do SROs look for when recruiting reviewers? Obviously, they demonstrated scientific expertise in that particular area, which is often bolstered by research support. NIH support used to be the gold standard. These days, that is not always true because at any given time, NIH receives far more number of good scientific applications than it is able to fund. So we do consider support, research support from other sponsors as well as NIH. We look for people, reviewers, experts with doctoral degree of equivalent. Breadth of perspective is often important because SROs often have to abide by several roster rules when we put together a review panel. And the more there are restrictions on how many reviewers we can use per panel sometimes. And the breadth of perspective always helps when you are talking about a broad study section like institutes have. We look for the ability to provide mature judgment, to work effectively within a group context, somebody who values and who would uphold the integrity of the review process, somebody who is impartial, and we also obviously look for diversity and geographic distribution when putting together a review panel. But really, most importantly, we look for lack of conflicts. And I can honestly say that this is the number one hurdle in putting together a review panel for clinical applications, especially when there are so many large clinical trials out there and so many collaborations in the field. Therefore, as any SRO will tell you, the roster or that you end up with is often not the roster that you started off with when you started recruiting for a particular review. What do reviewers look for in applications? So, as applicants, you must understand that reviewers need to understand what it is that you want to do, why it is important to do, and that you can do it. So specifically, they look for high impact ideas, exciting ideas. They look for clarity of thought in the way the application is written or organized. They look for awareness of any limitations of the study. They look for realistic aims and timelines. And in general, they look for a well-organized, well-written application. If a reviewer has to go back and forth 50 times to find something that you want them to find, that's half your battle lost. You need to be able to clearly identify the gap or the critical need in the field that your study proposes to address. Clearly define the objective of your study, lay out your central hypotheses clearly, develop the specific aims that helps you address the central hypothesis, and lead them by hand to the expected outcomes. And last but not least, address how the expected outcomes help you achieve the objective that you set out to achieve in the first place. Grant writing, I have heard said, is often equal parts science and marketing, and success truly requires that you do a good job in addressing both. So what specifically do reviewers evaluate? So this now, the next few slides gets into the process a little bit more in a little bit more granular detail. You can interrupt me anytime if you have questions. But I would like to come to the later slides and spend some more time on them, because I think that's what most applicants want to know as to what increases your chances for success. So in any case, what reviewers evaluate, they evaluate the overall impact of the application. And the overall impact is defined as the likelihood for the project to exert a sustained, powerful influence on the fields. It is arrived at by these core review criteria, which are 5 for most research grants: significance, which also factors in the strength of the rigor of the prior research; the investigators, the ability and the qualifications to conduct the research; innovation of the study or the project proposed; the approach, which considers and evaluates, which considers the rigor of the proposed study, proposed research, as well as any relevant biological variables; and last but not least, the environment or the suitability of the environment in which the research will be performed. The reason why approach is highlighted is because analysis at the NIH levels, at various levels at the NIH, have shown that despite the focus and the emphasis on all the review criteria, the overall impact score still remains heavily guided by the approach criterion score. In addition, reviewers also evaluate other score influencing review criteria, such as human subjects protections, inclusion policies, the appropriate use of vertebrate animals and biohazards when applicable, and non-score influencing considerations such as select agents, foreign organizations, resource sharing plans for data and model organisms or genome-wide association studies, authentication plans if applicable, and budget. One thing we try to steer reviewers away from is stating things like, making statements like, is this study even worth so many dollars? That's not the purview of review. Budget is an administrative issue. Rather, we would have the reviewers tell us whether the impact of the application on the field is likely to be incremental or large. Obviously, the higher the impact, the better your score. So data sharing plans are required for applications that seek $500,000 or more in direct costs, and should be provided in at least those applications, if not all. So before the meeting, each application is assigned to 3 or more reviewers for review in-house. The more complex the application, you can have more reviewers. Clinical trials often have 6 to 9. Reviewers get access to assignments and instructions via secure web interface about 4 to 6 weeks before a meeting. Special initiatives might involve reviewer orientation calls so as to get everybody on board in terms of what the objective of that particular program is and how best to evaluate all the applications, holding everybody's feet to the same fire, if you will. And reviewers are asked to upload preliminary scores and critiques by a specific deadline and read critiques posted by others assigned to the same application prior to the meeting. At the actual meeting, each review group has a chairperson who facilitates the discussions. Discussions start with the assigned reviewers stating their preliminary scores and taking turns to present their critiques. All non-conflicted members are then invited to join the discussion. Certain NINDS programs, such as our phase 3 clinical trials, may involve brief applicant interviews prior to final scoring, where reviewers might ask you to clarify certain doubts that they have, questions that usually come up as the discussions proceed. Chair will ask for comments or concerns on the additional review criteria, which also influence scores. Assigned reviewers provide final scores that set the score range. And lastly, the chair asks for comments or concerns on non-score influencing review considerations. This is generally the gist of how discussions proceed at a meeting. So discussions often focus on the strongest of the applications. Reviewers typically discuss the top half. These are the applications that get a numerical score when scores are released. The others are marked non-discussed on the score sheet. The applications in this triage bin, which means absolutely the reverse in review as it does in the ER, but these applications can be rescued for discussion by any unconflicted member of the panel, but we do require that they have read the application to rescue it. So coming back to the overall impact score a little, NIH uses a 9-point system to set scores, for overall impact scores, and these are roughly divided into low impact, medium impact, and high impact applications. You can see on this slide that there are score descriptors that basically talk about the balance of strength and weaknesses in any given application, and we really try to push reviewers to consider these descriptors when they are talking about evaluating an application and providing an overall impact score. The one mistake that many reviewers still continue to make, despite years and years of being a reviewer, is to equate overall impact with the significance of an application. And I cannot tell you how many times I've had to remind them that overall impact is a lot more than just the significance. The importance of the study is what counts towards the significance score, as does the robustness of the data that support the study. But the overall impact score must factor in the weaknesses in all other score influencing criteria, and therefore is much more in many cases than just the significance of the application. Reviewers often will come and say this is really important, it needs to be done, but fail to account for the weaknesses in the approach and the feasibility of the actual study. The final score range, as I mentioned earlier, is determined by the overall impact scores from the assigned reviewers. The panel members may vote outside this range, although any intent to do so must be declared. They might vote outside the range for a number of reasons. One might be a scientific difference of opinion. Other might just be a perceived mismatch between the words and the scores given by the assigned reviewers, or they may weigh the review criteria differently than, or the weaknesses and the strengths differently than the assigned reviewers did. For anything other than a scientific difference of opinion, they just have to let us know that they are voting outside the range. But if they are voting outside range for a different reason, and if they have a different opinion, they must send the SRO something in writings that can be incorporated in the summary statement. The overall impact score then is an average of each individual impact score. It is multiplied by 10, and this gives you and rounded up to the whole integer, which gives you 10 for the most meritorious and 90 for the least meritorious application. Sorry. Okay, so once the meeting is over, the SRO releases the scores and prepares the summary statements. All applications in a meeting receive scores for each of the core review criteria, critiques from the assigned reviewers, as well as any administrative notes. Only the applications that get discussed in a meeting receive a resume or a summary of the discussion, as well as an overall impact priority score and percentile ranking, provided the applications are percentile. So where to find your score or summary statement? This is your common screen that I alluded to earlier in my talk. So this is where your impact score, once it's released, will be seen. I believe applicants also get an email notifying them that the scores have been released. This is where, if the application were to be percentile, you will see the percentile. NINDS study sections might almost always have this row blank. This is where you click on to go to the next steps, which discusses issues like the timeline in which you might expect to see your summary statement. The study section of your Commons profile gives you the details of what review group will review your application, the council meeting date, the actual meeting date and time. And here is a link to the study section roster, which I will encourage you to look up every time you submit an application. And I'll come back to that in a minute. This is also where your career stage is reflected, and if this is not accurately reflective of what your dates are for your status as an early stage or new investigator, please make sure you contact officials at NIH to get that corrected, because that will be important for investigator-initiated proposals. So now we come to the nitty-gritty of what can actually help you increase your chances of success. And I'm going to talk about general tips first and go to specific programs in the next few slides. So read instructions in the FOA carefully. Make sure your application addresses all of the review criteria. Clarity counts. State hypothesis, rationale, design clearly. Clarify how the experiments you're proposing address the hypotheses. Address rigor in both the prior and the proposed research. Acknowledge any weaknesses in the former and state how the proposed work addresses those weaknesses. Factor in relevant variables, including age, sex, as the case may be. I would like to point out, though, that we do tell reviewers that rigor, while important, doesn't supersede the general principles of assessing whether or not a study is important to do. You can have a study that is supported by a solid rationale, rigorous prior data, but if the question you are asking is uninteresting or is not likely to have a meaningful clinical impact on the patients, it is unlikely that that study will score higher. So everything, the picture as a whole, the application package as a whole makes a difference. In the application itself, make sure you discuss anticipated outcomes, interpretation of the expected outcomes, results, and the potential pitfalls and backup strategies. You don't have to always have an answer or a solution to every hurdle you anticipate or in your study. But the fact that you have at least thought about it goes a long way in the actual review of your application. Most importantly, help reviewers do their job. Provide sufficient detail. Don't overstub, but also don't assume that reviewers will know what you mean. This is what I referred to earlier, in the sense that the SRG rosters are available to you. Just Google NIH SRG rosters and you will get this link. Will be the first hit that will show up in Google. And if you even though ad hoc expertise is added each round for study sections, if you take a look at the general expertise of a study section membership, you can cater or you can write your application for the majority on that panel, knowing what you can anticipate them knowing and what details you probably are better off spelling in greater detail. Likewise, the questions that the reviewers will be asked to answer in evaluating your application are right there in the FOA. So the easier you can make it for the reviewers to answer those questions, it's really half the battle won for you. I always tell applicants, take the reviewers by the hand and lead them, walk them through the application, lead them to where you want them to go. Make the application reader-friendly, present and organized and lucid write-up. Include well-designed, correctly labeled tables and figures. You have no idea how many times small attention to details like this can make a difference. Refer to and clearly cite relevant literature. Don't ignore literature that goes against your proposed hypothesis or this proposed study. Address it in the application. Avoid dependent names wherever possible. If you can't avoid them, make the best possible case of how you can, whether it's a milestone for cooperative agreements or otherwise, make the best possible case for the proposed aims. Include bio sketches from all key personnel and letters of support from all key advisors and collaborators. One point to note about the bio sketches, please make sure that the personal statement and the bio sketches from your key personnel actually refers to the study that you're proposing and not some other study that they were always part of. That happens a lot more than you would even guess. Don't appear to be sneaky or sloppy. Spelling, grammar, personal statements, all of those count. Don't be overly ambitious in your aim. Solicit criticism early. This, I cannot say this enough number of times. You will need time to make improvements. So actually have your mentors read what you have written. Don't just give them the elevator talk at this stage. Give them your proposal and make them read what you've written. And solicit advice from recent reviewers or applicants who have had success in obtaining NIH grants. So specifically, when you look at clinical trial applications, since this is a clinical trial methodology course, I thought I would spend some time talking about these. The dose, frequency, duration, route of administration. Is there adequate justification? Is the drug reaching the intended target at the right concentration? Pharmacokinetics, dynamics. Is there adequate exposure time? The biological mechanism. Is there a measure of target engagement? Is the intervention appropriately timed? Study population. Make a case for homogeneity versus generalizability. If previous studies in that particular disease have failed for reasons such as heterogeneous population, address why your study is different and can overcome some of those difficulties. Think carefully about controls, especially when you're proposing historic controls versus the state of the science and the state of practice in the field today. Inclusion, exclusion criteria, are they well justified? Are they overly restrictive? And can you actually get the subjects that you're proposing to recruit with the inclusion, exclusion criteria that you're proposing? Endpoints, are they well validated? Where applicable, you should also consider intervention effects in opposite directions. In recent times, we have seen a lot of composite outcomes come through in grant applications, but most applicants fail to address if the intervention has opposite effects on the components of the composite outcome, how they will be accounted for in analysis and in moving forward to the next phase of the study. Randomization, consider imbalance, bias, propose measures to measure the effectiveness of blinding, propose measures to monitor adherence and to measure compliance. Effect size, is it adequately justified? More importantly, is it clinically meaningful? Sample size calculations, what is the basis of your calculation? Does it account for loss to follow-up, and are those numbers realistic? Feasibility, recruitment, and retention. Again, are your estimates realistic? Is the timeline realistic? The analysis plans, most importantly, do they match the aims proposed? There are innumerable cases where a safety study is proposed, but the analysis plans are geared towards an efficacy study or vice versa. So talk to your statisticians early, engage them early, and make sure that your aims match your analysis plans. Are confounders addressed? Is power for secondary endpoints addressed wherever possible, especially in large phase 3 studies? Safety studies, wherever safety is an outcome, you must consider whether there are adequate stopping rules. Is there a truly independent safety monitor? I could go on and on with this, but just a few more things to consider. Imaging outcomes. When you have a multi-site trial, people often forget to consider whether there is an issue of there might be an issue due to lack of standardized equipment across sites. Centralized assessment wherever possible is always a plus. Our training of site personnel, is that well considered? Is there consistency in procedures across sites? That also leads to assessments, any assessments that might be proposed. When you are proposing to use fluid biomarkers, has attention been paid to standardized sample collection and handling? Collaborators and consultants, is there hands-on involvement and commitment to the study? Further clinical development, when you are proposing an early phase study, is the ultimate study that you are going to head towards clearly outlined in your study? Are there clear go, no-go decisions towards that study, thoughtful milestones that are often that are also quantitative? In human subjects protections, the consent forms, is adequate attention given to the language on the consent forms? Have you considered all adverse outcomes when all potential adverse outcomes, and are they listed clearly on the forms? Inclusion policies. One thing we always ask reviewers to pay attention to is whether the applicants are just providing lip service to NIH requirements, or whether they have provided concrete plans in the application, which is always a plus, and a scientific justification. Since there are enough early career members in the audience, I will touch briefly on fellowship and career development applications as well. The number one issue that we often see is in mentored applications, people don't read each other's portions of the applications. Absolutely do that. The mentor should clearly state what project the mentee can take with him or her. Most important, the training plan for the proposed research must be well coordinated with the research plan. If the project requires unique resources, say a patient cohort or specialized facilities, you must address the portability of the project or continued access to those resources. If it's a K99R00, you must clearly document the need for the mentored phase. If the primary mentor, if you have multiple co-mentors, the primary mentor must have a well-detailed plan for coordinating mentoring that is tailored to the particular applicant. For clinical mentored career development plan, if your primary mentor has a PhD, please make sure that there is a key clinical career advisor amongst the co-mentors who's actually engaged with your application. If the primary mentor is junior, likewise, make sure you include a senior mentor on your application who has had some experience mentoring and whose students, postdocs have gone on to independent academic careers. Institutional support matters. The chair's letter must provide the details of protected clinical and administrative duties. Lack of own space and equipment can be a red flag. Publications matter. Take advantage of the fact that NIH allows you to include preprints with you when you submit the application, even though we cannot accept them as post-submission materials. Eligibility, the criteria vary. When you are applying to a parent funding opportunity announcement, drill down to the IC specific language to know the limitations. There are certain leave of absences. There are notices published now that tell you that certain absences don't count against your clock, but please make sure you contact your program director early to ensure eligibility. If you don't get funded, despite all of this, then what? I would suggest take a deep breath, regroup, read your summary statement calmly and carefully, talk with your program official, evaluate your options. Sometimes it's a simple matter of knowing whether you have to what it is that reviewers want. So this is where talking to somebody who's an experienced and a successful grantee, NIH grantee, can help you tremendously. They can help you sort out whether the reviewers only want you to explain something a little bit more in detail, justify some decision of yours better, or whether actually revise and change that particular plan. Evaluate your options, whether you should revise and resubmit or whether you should choose a slightly different direction. And really, for most practical, for most cases, put your ego aside and try to be as responsive to the prior critiques in a resubmission as possible. We understand that reviewers often have diverse opinions. Here, talking to your program director can help, and in trying to address them the best way that you can. One common question that we get is, how do I address 30 pages of critique in a one-page introduction? I know it is hard, but you can use the one page of the introduction to summarize the key changes that were in your resume, and then direct the reviewers to the actual section in your application that specifically implement those changes. So one of the best ways that I know to build your grant writing skills is to actually serve as a reviewer. The NIH Center for Scientific Review has an early career reviewer program that you can sign up for. Prior NIH funding is not a requirement, so I suggest very much that you look into this. We at the ICs also look for a breadth of opinions, both from senior and junior investigators. So there might be opportunities here. You could send your CV to the chief of a review branch, either here at NINDS or to the IC, to another IC where you feel your expertise is better suited for. There are tons of qualities that make a good reviewer, really, but here are my top 6, if you will. Write evaluative critiques. We don't need to know in your critique what the applicant has already described in the application. For some reason, reviewers always think that it is their job to only find the negatives in an application. You couldn't be more wrong. Don't forget the strengths. Nobody likes a curmudgeon. Nobody listens to what the rest of the critique is if all you point out are the negatives. So definitely talk about the positives in a study. One thing that I learned early on from a mentor of mine is you critique the work, not the investigator. I understand that investigator is also a review criterion and you must evaluate the qualifications. But when you are writing your critique, if you critique the study proposed and not direct it at the investigators, it is often better received. When you are writing your critiques, part of writing evaluative critiques is also to state what the severity of the critiques the weaknesses that you identify. It helps applicants and the institute focus more, helps the applicants focus more on addressing the more important ones, and the institute focus more on deciding on what the balance of the severity is in making funding decisions. Revise criterion scores during the edit phase to match your final critiques. When you actually present, I know that you spend days reviewing that application, but present succinctly and cogently. Only focus on the main score driving issues. We don't have to hear every minor detail that you found wrong in that application. You are presenting not just for yourself, you are presenting to win over the rest of the members of the panel who have not read your application, and on average you have exactly 3 minutes to do so. So hit your highlights in the first 3 minutes and try to do it in a manner so that the person on the panel who is not in your field truly understands why something is a big deal for you, why something influenced your score to that extent. When you're presenting weaknesses, think about whether it's a weakness of that study or whether it's a weakness of that particular field or that particular disease, and present it in light of the big picture. Contribute to the discussions of unassigned applications. Take your disease-specific hat off and contribute to the group as a whole. Hold yourself and fellow reviewers accountable for the comments you make and for the scores you give. Be conscientious, uphold the confidentiality and integrity of peer review, identify conflicts with any applications in the meeting early, meet deadlines, and most importantly, show up. You have no idea how many people commit and then don't show up. And I actually wanted to add a bonus for NINDS study sections is have a sense of humor. But Joy told me this was being recorded, so I wasn't sure. So the last bit, and I will go through these really quickly. You will have my slides afterwards, so if you need them, need the links, you will get you will have access to them. This is a page on the Center for Scientific Review homepage that is designed just for applicants. It has everything that I talked about in greater detail, and I would strongly suggest at least going through the frequently asked questions. They have answers to most of the questions you would want to have answered. Based on your career stage, there are websites, there are research training websites at the NIH level as well as the NINDS level that have infographics based on your exact career stage and can direct you towards specific funding opportunities based on your career stage and career development goals. If you know the study section that your science is a good match to, you can request it now via the optional PHS assignment request form. Do check the FOA to see whether your application will be reviewed in an IC versus CSR though before you make that request. This is the link where the scientific rosters are available. If you don't know the study section, your science is a good match to, at least at CSR, there is now an assisted referral tool, which is linked right from their homepage, where you can essentially cut and paste your abstract into the tool and it will spit out best matches for study sections. Use the NIH reporter as much as you can. It's a public database of all funded NIH projects. There is also the federal reporter that searches federal agencies. But get to know the projects that are ongoing in your research area. You will know potential collaborators or competitors that way. So one particularly good feature of the NIH reporter is this feature called the Matchmaker. You can essentially cut and paste your keywords, specific aims, abstracts, whatever you choose, and it spits out a result that looks something like this. It will tell you the institutes and the centers that are funding projects like yours, what activity codes, what funding mechanisms are most used by for this kind of research, and the study sections that typically review applications like yours. You will get to know what institutes are also funding similar projects. So absolutely, this is one of the best tools that I think NIH Reporter has, and I encourage all of you to use it. A lot of applicants ask whether they should contact the NIH before applying. Absolutely. It's mandatory in certain cases. It is optional when RFAs request a letter of intent, and it's really recommended whenever you think of applying for a grant. Whom should you contact and when? Before you submit, it's the program officer or the SRO if it's a submission-related question. After you submit till your summary statements are released, it's your SRO that you should be in touch with. And after you review, it's your assigned program officer or your grants management specialist who monitors the awards, fiscal aspects of your award. So these are just some additional resources, and I'm going to stop here now and see if any of you might have questions. Thank you for your time.
Shanta, thank you. That was a great presentation. Are there any questions or comments? And you're welcome to use the chat too if you don't want to speak up.
So this is great news, which means every application that is going to come for review is going to be crystal clear.
Shanta, someone said thanks. It was a great presentation.
No sweat. You're welcome to write to me if you have questions. That's not a problem at all. I will do my best. I used to be much more responsive when workloads were better, but I will still do my best to answer as quickly as I can.
Okay, one more chance to ask questions or comment from anyone. Let's see. People are saying that they agree that this was super helpful, and thank you, Shanta. So
happy to have been of help.
So thank you again. I just want to remind everyone who attended today, if you're interested in CME, and even if you're not, if you could please evaluate the webinar. It does help us to plan for future webinars. And that our next webinar is September 24th at noon Eastern. So be looking out for an email announcing that as well. So thank you again, Shanta. I really appreciate it. And thank you everyone for joining us today.